Now here's the question almost nobody asks seriously. Why did the Messiah have to suffer before entering his kingdom? Now I know you've heard the answer. It's the catechism. It's the Easter sermon. It's the systematic theology. He suffered to fulfill the prophetic scriptures. Isaiah 53, and the servant would be pierced for transgressions. Psalms 22 described the crucifixion in detail. Daniel 9 timed the cutting off of the Anointed One. The suffering was prophesied. Therefore it was necessary. Therefore it happened. And that answer is true, absolutely. But it's radically incomplete, because it treats the suffering as the mechanical output of a textual machine. The prophecy said X, therefore X had to happen, end of explanation. And that framing misses the question entirely. The question is not whether the suffering was prophesied. Of course it was. The question is why the Father designed the revelation this way. Why this specific form? Why suffering rather than triumph? Why the cross before the crown? What is the soteriological logic, not just the historical sequence, that makes this the necessary shape of the Messiah's coming? Because the texts, particularly Paul, give you a very specific answer. The suffering is not incidental to the design. It is the design. And understanding why changes everything about what you think the Messiah came to do and what the kingdom he is building actually is. And if you transpose all of this about Jesus the person to the minimized, denied, and murdered prophetic word of Messiah itself, then you really start to see how the dysfunction and hypocrisy of our modern church functions. We are still putting Jesus on the cross in the same way we do the prophetic word of him, by its relegation to noise, background information, or disposable naivete, when it's the whole of the Christian faith itself. Yes, the fact is that Jesus is the Word. We can't escape this no matter how we try. But in the end, we must ask, what kind of Word is he? We refuse to go there because we know that if we did, it would trigger a cascading series of To understand why the revelation had to take this form, you have to understand what it is designed to address. And that means going back to Eden. The sin problem in the biblical narrative is not primarily moral failure. It is revelational refusal. God provides a revelation that is real, external, and sufficient, and humanity chooses the self-generated alternative. This is the serpent's offer in Genesis 3, not primarily forbidden fruit, but self-generated knowledge, autonomous knowledge. A knowing that does not depend on receiving it from outside, but is produced from within. You will be as gods, knowing good and evil. Replace the received word with the autonomous self as the source of truth about God and reality. Now think about how this works in practice. The self-generated alternative is always more comfortable than the received revelation. It's more responsive to prior commitments. It's more flattering to the person generating it. It asks less and conforms more. The received revelation arises from outside the self, from the transcendent, and demands reception on its own terms, which means it will sometimes conflict with what you already think, what you already want, what you already are. The self-generated alternative never does that. It is perfectly calibrated to you because you made it. Now, this is why the prophets were rejected generation after generation. It's because Israel lacked religious devotion. It is because the received word, the fulfilled messianic prophecy, kept arriving in forms that conflicted with what the self-generated tradition had already decided about God. And when the true were in competition, the religious, traditional, experiential choice constantly won. The messianic prophecy was managed, domesticated, absorbed into the tradition, and neutralized until it could no longer be absorbed, until the word arrived in person, undeniably, in a form that couldn't be domesticated, and then it was murdered. That is the problem the messianic prophecy, that messianic prophecy is designed to solve, not by forcing reception, by making the choice unavoidable, and it's still the choice today. Paul addresses this directly in 1 Corinthians 1 through 2. And I want to be specific about what he means, because if the wisdom of God here and the word of the cross are taken as generalities, the argument collapses into pious sentiment. These are not generalities. This phrase, the word of the cross, ho logos to staro, is the specific proclaimed correspondence between what the prophetic declaration said would happen to the servant and what historically happened at Calvary. It is not a message about the cross in a general devotional sense. It is the oracular word, the prophetic declaration of Isaiah 53, Psalms 22, Zechariah 12:10, meeting its fulfillment in the specific historical event of the crucifixion. The word of the cross is the prophetic revelation in its completed form, declared before the conditions of its fulfillment existed, confirmed when those conditions arrived. The specific correspondence, the declaration and the event holding together, is what Paul calls the word of the cross. And he says this word is foolishness to those who are perishing and the power of God to those being saved. Not accidentally foolish, deliberately foolish, designed to be received as foolishness by a particular kind of mind. Now, the wisdom of God is the same thing seen from the other side. 1 Corinthians 1:24, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. And 1 Corinthians 2:7 through 8, we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom, which God ordained before the world unto our glory, which none of the princes of this world knew. For had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. The wisdom of God is the prophetic plan, the declaration that preceded the incarnation, the mission the Son was sent to complete, the specific shape of the servant's suffering and vindication. It was hidden not because it was inaccessible, but because it was designed to be invisible to a particular kind of reasoning. And here's the key insight. The very fact of crucifying the Lord of glory is the proof that the design worked exactly as intended. The rulers of this age, the most sophisticated religious and political minds of the first century, could not receive this revelation precisely because their entire approach to God was organized around self-generated wisdom. And in their refusal, they fulfilled the very declaration they were refusing. The wisdom of God used their rejection of it to complete itself. This is not accidental. This is the design. Now we can answer the question, why did the Messiah have to suffer before entering his kingdom? It's this. Because the suffering sets an epistemic bar that can only be cleared by genuine love of truth. The bar is the epistemic force of messianic prophecy itself upon the mind and spirit. Every prior revelation in Israel's history was susceptible to self-interested reception. The manna in the wilderness was received by people who needed food. The Exodus demonstrations were received by people who needed liberation. The prophetic oracles were preserved by people who found them useful for national identity and covenant continuity. In every case, the revelation could be received for reasons that had nothing to do with love of truth itself. The messianic prophetic fulfillment is structured differently. The entire form of the revelation has been stripped of every self-interested reason to receive it. The Messiah arrives not in triumph, but in humility. Not as a political liberator, but as a suffering servant. Not conferring status on his followers, but telling them to take up their cross. Not confirming the existing religious establishment, but exposing and judging it. Born in obscurity, from a despised region, working with his hands, dying as a criminal between thieves. Every feature of this arrival is the inversion of what self-aggrandizing religion wants from God. Now, Philippians 2, 5 through 8. The Son made himself of no reputation and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. The self-emptying, the kenosis, is not incidental to the design. It is the design. The revelation comes in the form that eliminates every motivation for receiving it except the right one. Pride cannot receive this. Ego-driven spirituality cannot receive a crucified Messiah as the wisdom of God. The desire for status cannot receive a Lord who demands you lose your life to find it. Now, the stumbling stone of Isaiah 8:14 and Romans 9. I want to take a little bit of time on this because this is important. Romans 9:32 through 33. Israel stumbled at that stumbling stone. As it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed. Paul is citing two texts here. Psalms 118:22, the stone the builders rejected becoming the cornerstone, and Isaiah 8:14, written in the 8th century before Christ, 7 centuries before Paul. Isaiah 8:14 deserves careful reading because it does something important. And he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling, and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, for a gin and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The one the Father sends is simultaneously a sanctuary to those who receive him and a stone of stumbling to both houses of Israel. Now, there is a reading of the servant in Isaiah, ancient and still maintained, that identifies the servant as corporate Israel, the righteous remnant, the faithful community, Israel as the suffering witness to the nations. That reading has its own internal consistency on certain texts. But Isaiah 8:14 breaks it on its own terms. If the servant is Israel, if the stone is the righteous remnant, the faithful community, then the text is saying that Israel is a stone of stumbling to Israel, that the righteous remnant is a rock of offense to itself, that the faithful community is a gin and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. That reading produces an absurdity no one actually holds. No interpreter argues that the righteous remnant of Israel constitutes a stumbling block to corporate Judaism. The text requires a distinct figure, someone whom Israel encounters, whom some receive as a sanctuary and others stumble over. The stone has to be something Israel trips over, not something Israel is. And this was declared in the 8th century before Christ. The one the Father sends will divide Israel. Some will find sanctuary in him. Others, those who approach him through the framework of self-generated religious tradition, will stumble. The division is announced before it happens. When the religious establishment of first century Judaism stumbles over the crucified Messiah exactly as Isaiah 8:14 said they would, it is not a tragedy that interrupted the plan. It is the plan confirming itself. This is the same structure as 1 Corinthians 1. The word of the cross, not just the person, but the word, the prophetic word, which Jesus is foolishness to those perishing. The stone of stumbling is laid in Zion 7 centuries before the cross. The division is not a regrettable outcome. It is the declared intention of the revelation and the proof that the revelation is what it claims to be. The timing of both the person and word of the messianic revelation is calibrated with the same precision as its form. It cannot come too early. For a first century Palestinian to examine the correspondence between Isaiah 53 and the crucifixion, he needs literacy, a connected world in which the proclamation can spread, freedom from the sheer daily burden of physical survival sufficient to engage a question about the identity of the Messiah seriously. A pre-literate, pre-urban society doesn't have that capacity. Rome provides exactly this. A literate, urbanized, administratively connected world with roads that carry ideas as well as goods, with a common language in which the proclamation can spread, with a legal and philosophical culture sophisticated enough to engage the claim seriously. Galatians 4:4, when the fullness of time was come, is not mystical. It is historical. The revelation arrives when humanity has developed the capacity to engage it honestly. But it cannot come at the completion of the revelation either. Isaiah 11:9, the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. That is the millennial kingdom, the state of full disclosure, where the knowledge of God is not a claim to be examined, but a reality openly manifest. At that point, the choice is no longer available in the same way. So the revelation comes in the interval between Rome's literacy and the kingdom's full disclosure. This interval is the present age. The present age is defined by the person as well as the word of the cross, the specific completed prophetic fulfillment available to anyone willing to examine it honestly, demanding examination on its own terms. This is why the kingdom fills slowly and relatively sparsely. This is not a failure of revelation. It is the revelation working exactly as designed. 1 Corinthians 1:26 through 29. Not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the mighty. Not many wise, not many mighty, not many noble. The revelation is specifically calibrated against the self-aggrandizing approach to God, against the wisdom that cannot receive the word of the cross, the power that cannot humble itself before a crucified Messiah, the status that cannot take up a cross. The kingdom does not fill quickly because it cannot fill with people receiving it for the wrong reasons. Every ulterior motive fails at the cross. What comes through is what genuinely loves the truth more than itself. And those people are in every generation relatively few, scattered across every culture and social location, from every era. The ones who, when confronted with the specific prophetic correspondence and the specific form of the Messiah's arrival, choose it over everything the self-generated alternative was offering. Luke 24:26. Ought not Christ to have suffered these things and to enter his glory? The suffering is the path to glory, not incidentally, necessarily. The glory of the kingdom is constituted by the very suffering that purified the revelation, that eliminated every reason to receive it except love of truth itself, and therefore selected the people from whom the kingdom is built. The Messiah had to suffer before entering his kingdom because the kingdom could only be built from the people the suffering selects. The cross is simultaneously the supreme instance of the essential sin, the self-generated religious establishment murdering the received revelation, and the supreme purification of the revelation, the elimination of every reason to receive it except the right one. The sin of Eden was the choice of self-generated alternative over the received word. The cross is the moment at which that choice is made at maximum clarity, maximum stakes, and maximum consequence. The rulers of this age did not know the wisdom of God, for had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory, and in not knowing it, they completed it. This is why Christ had to suffer. In the same way, it's why revelation also had to be sidelined, debased, abused, and murdered before it was vindicated in resurrection under the appearance of failure. Not because the textual machine required it, because nothing less could build what the Father was building.